Right. So as I said, I'm a recovering architect, I think is a way of describing it. I started life from a very young age wanting to be an architect. I mean, I think I was 6 or 7 when I was drawing my first houses, and was very, very kind of consistent in this vision about wanting to grow up to be an architect. So inevitably went to architecture school and then got myself a job with this guy, Renzo Piano, and spent a number of years in this office in Italy and also in Paris. I was sort of bottom left in that picture. I guess the screens are quite small. And Renzo sat on the right, and there were kind of 50 of us, and we did some pretty interesting museum projects and cultural projects, things that were at the kind of higher end of the design spectrum, let's say. So people often think of being an architect as being, someone who sits in a nice office like this and kind of, spending a lot of the day gazing kind of wistfully off into the distance, doing sketches and sort of thinking about what the next great design could be, and then magically it happens. And Renzo actually does sketches like that, and he does sit at that table and think about what needs to happen. But of course, we don't get to do that. If we're in the team, we're just supposed to turn the sketch into something real. So I spent 5 years taking little sketches and trying to figure out how to get them built and how to respect the budget. And it was a really interesting problem to have and a fascinating job to have. A certain point, the hours worked and the complete lack of pay for those hours worked kind of took its toll, and I went to the dark side, as my architect friends say, and went off and did the MIT program, and I graduated in 2008. So I now, as I said, work at Hines in the UK. These are some of the things that we own. We do a lot more buying and selling of buildings than building of them at the moment. The building on the top right, that's in Canary Wharf, and we closed on that sale and leaseback with Morgan Stanley about 2 hours ago. So we've been busy this week. No. So the role is very different, and often I get questions about whether I miss being an architect, whether I miss the kind of creative exercise of architecture, doing what is now a kind of more dry profession, doing real estate investing. And I don't. I say I don't. And part of the reason is sort of what I alluded to earlier about how design and being an architect isn't quite as the kind of creative kind of dream that everyone might make it out to be, but also because I think that real estate investing is a lot more creative than people kind of often give it credit for. And part of the reason is that there are lots of unquantifiable elements to real estate investing that we don't often talk about because we're so focused on trying to be kind of rational investors. So these unquantifiable elements are the ones that really fascinate me, and I think are actually a lot of times the ways that we separate really successful investors from those who sort of are middle of the pack. So if we think about how kind of the unquantifiable works in real estate investing, we might think about the difference between looking at the past and looking at the future. The past is certain. We know what happened. There's lots of quantitative information. There's data. There are precedents. And if we're really lucky, we get to run regressions on all that data. Whereas the future is uncertain. So the information is qualitative. We're looking at forecasts. We're making speculation, and maybe we have some vision about what would happen. So in short, the uncertainty is a lot more fun. There's a lot more you can do with it. And this brings up the sort of the split for me in terms of what real estate investing is about, and it's a combination of numbers and no's. And it's that blend of the two which makes the difference between people who are just following the pack and those who are maybe leading. So moving sideways and talking a little bit about design itself then, obviously if we're talking about how design can influence value, we need to define what good design is. And one of the things that makes it a little bit tricky is that there aren't many absolutes. It really depends on what you're trying to have design do for you, what the product is in relation to the job it's trying to do. So it depends on your perspective. Good design, however, does have a couple of key attributes which I think are pretty universal. It's always appropriate. That ties into this idea of being good for the job it's set up with, being relative to the perspective you're coming from, and it's also timeless. So good design isn't something that's going to be a fad that will disappear in 6 months or even a couple of years. The good designs are the ones that stay on, and probably none of that is hugely controversial. But if we're trying to kind of dig a bit deeper, we probably need to split out design a little bit. And the way I do it is I separate it into two categories. One is what I call parametric design, and the second one is the emotional side of design. So to start with parametric design, because I think a lot of people, when they think about what good design is, this is sort of the stuff they're talking about. And what they're saying is, does the design tick the boxes that I'm trying to have ticked? So in the UK, if we're doing an office building, there's something called the British Council of Offices Standard. It's a long list of tick boxes about what your building needs to be if you're going to be a BCO compliant scheme. It's very clear to say, are you a good building or a not good building per the BCO standard? So it's all about features. Do I have this? Do I have that? Do I not do it? And so forth. There's another element of parametric design which is maybe a little bit harder to quantify, but does relate to building quality or to physical quality or to reliability. That is the kind of the thing we look for when we're paying more for an expensive watch or an expensive car, perhaps. And then there's also convenience. And these are slightly fluid concepts, but I think that the thing that brings them together is the idea that you can compare different products, be they buildings or cars or watches or websites, on these types of features and come up with a pretty, let's say, rational view of what is the best design. And that will get you a certain distance. It's a comparable-based approach, and this is the kind of approach that people in real estate really like. In real estate, we love looking at comparable evidence. It's one of the things that we rely on to figure out whether our assumptions make sense or not. But it's only going to get you so far. It's going to get you into the middle of the pack. You're going to know where the pack is, but you're not going to be able to kind of go beyond. And when we talk about going beyond, this guy and this product is a pretty good place to start. The iPad, I think they've sold something like 200 million iPads in the last couple of years. And what was interesting about the iPad was that when it came out, nobody really was sure whether people were going to have a use for it. And there were lots of questions right when it was launched about whether this was going to fit between the phone and the computer. And indeed, I think anybody that owns an iPad will kind of acknowledge that it's almost a bit of a toy. I mean, it does some things, but it's mainly just quite nice. And yet they've sold 200 million of them on this sort of fuzzy, I don't know, I kind of like it, it's kind of amazing, and I think I should have one. And it doesn't matter that it's $600, I still want one. And that's a pretty amazing phenomenon. And what's amazing about it is that it goes well beyond anything that you could come up with in a spreadsheet in terms of ticking boxes. So there is something really powerful here about what good design can do if it kind of goes beyond parameters and starts dealing with emotion. And so we can say that good design creates desire. And that's really where it gets interesting. It's easily the hardest thing, but it does have a clear impact on value. And so we can start to pull these things together, the emotional side and parametric side. And if you can think about maybe going to buy a car or a computer or something like that, and how that in a little interplay works in your head, it's pretty interesting. So you might arrive in the car showroom, say, and look at something and say, I like that. I like the way it looks. It's a thing for me. And you might have that reaction before you sit back and say, is it actually what I need? And that might be the second step of your kind of your interface with this object and what it's doing. There's an emotional reaction, then there's this sort of more pragmatic thing. I mean, does it do what I need it to do? Yes, no, I'm not sure. And if it does, then you're probably going to be a buyer of that office space or that car or whatever it happens to be. And these two things play together and bring up a third thing, which is about identity. Because ultimately, when we're buying products, and products, again, can be buildings or cars or watches or any kind of service, it does tie back to whether this design ties back to what I think about myself, right? if I am buying a Porsche, it's because I think I'm the kind of person that buys Porsches, and I like the fact that I'm a Porsche kind of owning guy. Or I might say, actually, I don't like cars at all. I think they're a waste of money. I'm eco-green, and I buy bikes. I don't buy cars. I don't want a Porsche. I don't want any car, actually. So they reinforce identity, and they can also help with this thing about, I think that guy is amazing, and I kind of want to be like him, or I like that organization, and I want to be like them, so I'm going to buy and associate myself with the products that enable me to do that. So there's this interesting link together of emotional and parametric elements of design. And so we can see how this works at a number of scales. The personal scale, if you're buying a house, I'm currently trying to buy a house right now, and there are these questions about what kind of house is my kind of house. Am I kind of a more traditional guy who kind of likes a traditional design even if the building is new, want a porch and a kind of garden and so forth, or am I kind of more urban, cool, I want white furniture and a white room with white floors, and I'm that kind of person. And you kind of pick what suits your kind of you better, and you're going to go in that direction. We can look at it at a corporate scale. This is the IBM headquarters up in upstate New York. IBM has been headquartered, their global headquarters, outside of New York City for years and years and years. And this is what they built in the mid-50s, right as IBM was kind of on its way to becoming Big Blue. And you can see what kind of organization they think they are. They're rational, they're clean, they're methodical. It's the era of white shirts and dark ties, kind of like what I'm wearing today. And it's a reasonably sizable building for being in the middle of nowhere. A couple of years later, a couple of years ago rather, they built a new headquarters building just down the road. And it's really interesting to see what this organization is saying about itself. The building is set in the landscape, it's not orthogonal anymore, it's very sustainable, and it's a lot smaller. So IBM is using the design of their building to say who they are to the outside world. So they're using it as a tool to describe their identity. We can also look at cities that way. You can sort of think about cities tying into people's identities and the type of identity that they want to have for themselves. So I might say that I'm a Denver kind of guy. I'm a bit of a mountain man, and I'm gonna, I like the kind of the Rocky Mountains, and I want to go shoot animals and go skiing. Still in the city, but I'm that kind of guy. Or I might be a kind of more kind of like urban, money is everything, greed is good, kind of New York kind of guy who's just all about the greenbacks and nature. I could really care less. But I'm going to tie into one of these things and see which one speaks to me. And if I feel like I'm a Denver kind of guy, I'm probably not going to spend much time in New York. I'm going to move to Denver if I can. Or I'm going to move to New York if I can. So we're going to interact with things that help us define who we are. And that's really where design starts to work and starts to add value. So we can start to say that if you make yourself an identity and make yourself a distinct identity, then you're on the path to creating value. Now I can't tell you if it's a good path or not, because it's very, very complicated, but I can tell you that you're heading in the right direction. And that brings us sort of back to real estate again, and to this concept of locations, right? That if this is the only thing that matters in real estate, then we might say that the way we're going to create value in real estate is by making locations, and maybe we can use design as a way of making a location, and that would be a good way of using design. And it's not, locations aren't as rational as they might seem, right? I mean, if we come back to London, the highest retail rents anywhere in town are on Bond Street. Bond Street rents are, I don't know, £400 a square foot on average, something like that. The street right next door, which from a parametric basis you could argue has pretty much the same characteristics, still in a historic neighborhood, still very central. Street, if you blinked, would look the same, and yet the rents are 1/4 of what they are on Bond Street. And that's because there's this cachet, this brand that's associated with the location, that people want to be part of Bond Street. The retailers like saying they have space on Bond Street. People like saying they're going shopping on Bond Street because it sounds fancy. So there's an idea that if we can make locations or brand locations, then maybe we can create value. And of course, that's what people do. So we look at Soho in New York, which has a certain kind of warehouse, cool vibe to it, and has really fused kind of cultural practice, arts and so forth, and design with commerce. They've done really well. And maybe the answer is just to brand it like they branded it, and we'll create some value for ourselves. So we could be in Seattle and call it Sodo. We could be in San Francisco and call it Soma. We could be in Denver and call it Lodo, or in Los Angeles and call it NoHo. And that would be a cheap way of doing it. You put some signs up, you say we're NoHo, and hopefully that really works for you. The issue, of course, is that the best you're ever going to do is remind people of somewhere else. And another example, which is actually pretty extraordinary, the number of these that exist, is Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley, there's a Silicon Alley, there's a Silicon Roundabout in London, Silicon Fen, which is in Cambridge, northeast of here, Silicon Alley in Berlin, Silicon Cape, Silicon Wadi, and then my favorite, which shows at least that they have a sense of humor, is the Philicon Alley in Philadelphia, which I thought was really great. But you sort of wonder, I mean, if you really are Silicon Cape, I mean, is that really going to be the thing that's going to bring the tech people to your version of a kind of tech hub, is by copying something that's obviously very successful a long way away? There's a question about it. And so branding, actual branding is one way to kind of create a location and create value. The other way you can do it, of course, is to make a location. And that's great, but there's some obvious complications with it. If you want to, make a city or something like that, or even make a submarket, you need to figure out who's going to pay and who's going to benefit. And often when we look at areas, like more London around here, there's a lot of great public realm, and that is actually what brings people together and makes a place. But you need to figure out who's going to pay for that, because often the people paying for the public realm aren't recovering the upside directly. So you've got a question of money, and you've got a question of cooperation, and that makes it quite difficult. With that said, there's some amazing examples around, and I really feel that if we're talking about how design can create value, one of the areas are in these public spaces. And actually, that if you spend money and take care of the design of public spaces, you can create lots and lots of value, well beyond spending lots of money on fancy architecture like this. So a few examples just to kind of show how this can work. Classic one, which is very well established now, is taking a sort of forgotten and forlorn historic district and turning it into kind of a retail destination. This is Covent Garden, which was the wholesale fruit and vegetable market in London. It's now majority owned by Capital and Counties, which is a UK prop co. This is their holdings. It's worth about £1.5 billion today, and it's very successful. There's lots of street traffic. They're using the public spaces really well for street performance, which is not organized by the owners, but has been encouraged. And the real sign of success for any kind of public space, they have their own Apple store. So really, they've come to the top of the game. They've created a lot of money and helped Apple make even more. Another way you can make places and create value is by getting the government to help. I think a number of you went to Canary Wharf yesterday and looked at Canary Wharf. Canary Wharf is a really interesting example. The government created an enterprise zone in the 80s, a long way away from anywhere else that had office space. They cut the taxes right down. They encouraged development to happen. And through a few bumps along the road, it has happened. Canary Wharf Group has done a very, very good job of creating an environment that is very attractive to big-scale financial services occupiers. They have figured out what identity those occupiers want, and they've delivered a very, very good set of buildings and an environment that makes those occupiers feel very comfortable. So they're using design in a very targeted way to figure out who they're trying to be. So that involves, again, public spaces. It involves very efficient buildings. It involves lots of shopping for all these banks and these bankers who are looking for something to do at lunchtime. And it's an incredible success. But it does need that kickstart from the government. And then a final example, and I think this one is, if you get a chance to see it and you don't know it, is really interesting. This is Broadgate, which is up by Liverpool Street Station and was a private developer doing this, reclaiming rail yards. And there's a couple of rail yards projects in London that have been very successful. King's Cross is another example that I could have used, but it's not quite finished. Broadgate was developed in the early 90s, late 80s. And what's interesting about Broadgate, if you go up there, is that it's very successful. Occupiers think it's a great place to be. And yet the buildings they're only okay. What are really good, though, are the public spaces in between the buildings. So that's one square. They've got another ice rink, just like Canary Wharf. Everybody has an ice rink. They've got a really great square with a grid that lights up at night in different colored patterns, and so on. The space between two buildings on the Broadgate Tower, which you can probably just about see in the distance. So they've really focused on the space between the buildings as a way of creating that identity again for what this place is, and by so doing, making something that appeals to occupiers, and if it appeals to occupiers, you've made money. So the final way to do it, and this is maybe more universal because you don't always have a historic district and you don't always have government help. The other example is that you build it from scratch. And this is the Mall of America in Bloomington, I think, Minnesota, or Burlington, Minnesota. It's 5 million square feet. People fly in from all over the US to see this place. And it's made a universe for itself. Now, you might say that it's not in your taste, or you think it's tacky and you don't want to go on the roller coaster. But it is phenomenally successul, and it's done that because it's been able to create a really coherent identity about what it is for itself, and it's targeted the types of people that it thinks will appeal to that. And it's not just in the States. This is Stratford in White City, which is a shopping mall that opened in London about 3 years ago. And you might think that London is a kind of big urban global capital type place that a shopping mall wouldn't work because people would just want to be out in the real city. But no, this one is very successful. They've just opened another one by the Olympic Park in Stratford, and they're doing phenomenally well. And if you go to either of them, what's really interesting is how much money has been visibly spent in all the spaces between the shops. They have spent a fortune on these malls. And the reason they've done it is because if you go in here, even if you don't have a lot of money to spend, you feel rich. And if you feel rich, your credit card will come out. And they are very, very savvy about this. They've created these environments where you come in off of a slightly grubby high street, and then all of a sudden, it's a palace. And it's, the shopping mall is by no means dead, and these buildings being this successful in this city is proof of that. Of course, there is an issue with shopping malls generally, and it is that while they are creating value, they're sucking the value up into the building. It's inward focusing, and they're not creating value really for anyone else surrounding. So this is an example in Manchester. It's a relatively extreme example, but even the examples in London are closed, and while they're creating value for themselves, they're not really helping the guys down the street. So that's the kind of urban, let's say, neighborhood district scale, and this focus on spaces between buildings being a way to create identity, and by creating identity, you create value. You can also obviously do that with buildings, and the buildings are, not every building can do this, and not every building should do this, but certain buildings have been very successful about creating value for the wider area. And the prime example of this is the Guggenheim in Bilbao, designed by Frank Gehry. It's a really extraordinary building. You don't get many buildings that are clad in titanium. It's pretty special. I certainly hadn't heard of Bilbao until this building was built. And now I think most people have heard of Bilbao, and many people have heard of this building. As a result, it has created a huge amount of value for that city by virtue of being an extraordinary building. So if you ever wanted to look at an example of where design has created value, this is proof that it's possible. Another example, which is right here, which I think is really interesting, is the Shard. The Shard is the centerpiece for a whole series of developments that are happening on the South Bank here. More London, which we're part of here, has been around for a number of years. And yet, the whole neighborhood didn't really have an identity until this building was built, because this is obviously a landmark, and you can like the design or not like the design, but it is distinct and it does have character. And importantly, although there's a spire at the top, if you go into London Bridge Station, it's really been transformed from something that was quite grubby to something kind of quite dramatic. And in so doing, they've given a centerpiece to this district, and rents in this area are going up. I mean, more London rents are on the order of 40 to 45 pounds a square foot, and they're getting 70 pounds a square foot in the Shard. So part of that is to do with being part of the Prestige project, but it's also about giving this area more of an identity for office occupiers. And then finally, Central St. Giles, which is another Renzo Piano project, I'm afraid to say, but it is relevant. I had an art professor when I was in high school, and he made some crack about how if you can't make it good, make it big, and if you can't make it big, make it red. And that's what Central St. Giles has done to a certain degree. And I think I'd say that the Guggenheim Bilbao is good, and the Shard is obviously big, and this one, well, some of it's red. So it's clad in colored ceramic panels, and you can see that it's been broken up into a series of different kind of sub-blocks. It's actually all linked together. It's very distinctive, and I know firsthand that some prospective occupiers walked up to this building and turned around and walked off in the other direction because they just didn't like it. It wasn't them. It wasn't their kind of building. It's what they call in the UK a Marmite building. Does everybody know what Marmite is? It's very distinctive. Anyway, I'm American. I don't like it. My other half is not American. She likes it. So anyway, so it's Marmite. So some people like it, some people don't, but it is clear about what it is. And it's been very successful in attracting trendier media and tech companies. So the likes of Google and NBC have their offices here. You might make a joke about how the logos and the colors of the logos are kind of slightly tied into the colors of the building, but maybe that's just chance. In any case, it's edgier and it's more fun, and it's worked to attract a certain type of occupier. So it's tying the design into the identity and creating value that way. And then a final example, which I think is really fun. I don't think you can do this everywhere. This was a kind of local mid-sized developer in Miami. He had a shopping center and needed more parking. He could have gone off to make a little kind of 3-4-story parking garage for $2.50, but instead he flew to Switzerland and he hired Herzog and de Meuron, the fancy Swiss architects, and he built this, which is probably one of the more extraordinary parking garages that exists in the world. It's certainly one of the few with a fashion boutique on the top floor, and probably one of the few that's able to host weddings and fashion shows. So again, not everybody is going to create a really unusual parking garage in this way, but there's no question that they've created a huge amount of value by doing something extraordinary here and giving themselves a really clear identity. So that's the great news about creating icons. When it works, there's absolutely nothing like it. Those buildings are kind of like the iPad. They're special, and they're doing something that's special. Of course, it doesn't always work, and if you get it wrong, it can be very, very wrong. Just as a word of caution, if you don't know, this is the Rongyong Hotel in Pyongyang in North Korea. It's 105 stories tall. It was built started construction in 1987. They only finished the cladding in 2012. It's still unopened. And in terms of an identity for a city, it's just a bit troubling. I mean, if this is sort of the big landmark in Pyongyang, if there's any doubt that it was a big brother state, you've got that question answered pretty clearly. So it is a risky game. You don't want every building to be an icon, but it would be a shame if we didn't try now and again. So there's some obvious reasons why we don't make better destinations at that sort of micro-urban or urban scale, or at the building scale when the building is sort of a destination. Obviously, this comes back to comparables. It's much easier for everyone to just copy something that's been done before, to take an idea and just say, oh, we're going to do it. It's like this other thing. And the unique identities are harder to do well. It takes real creativity. It takes an idea. It takes spark. And then you have to convince everyone that it's the way to go forward. And it's all expensive, so there's a lot of money involved. And that does make our profession, makes innovation in our profession harder than in other fields where the in costs are smaller. And this last point relates to, I think, a really fundamental issue in real estate, which is that a lot of the bigger real estate holdings and the bigger deals are dominated by large organizations, and large organizations often tend towards the kind of happy medium or mean. That there's a big investment committee, there's lots of risk officers, there's lots of people preventing unusual or different things happening. There's lots of people reliant on evidence to protect their own jobs because they don't want to make mistakes. And so large organizations can tend to avoid anything that might be new and different, even if that's actually the way to do best. So this comes back to the kind of the thought about the numbers and nose and vision, and it comes back to personalities as well, because ultimately when you think about really successful organizations, the ones that have really moved the profession on, they're often fronted by really unique individuals. So you know Donald Trump, Jerry Hines, for those who don't recognize him, is bottom right, Steve Jobs and Renzo Piano, all being strong personalities that are able to bring big, innovative projects through on the force of their character. And I guess if I'm kind of in favor of something, I'm in favor of a world where there are more big visionaries and fewer faceless, nameless investment committees backed up by risk officers, because I think in terms of where the profession is going and the big breakthroughs, we need these kinds of people to be trusted to make the big calls. And this ties into sort of a final point that I think is worth making about what kind of our responsibility as real estate professionals is. Because although our first obligation is to our investors to make good returns for our investors and to protect their investments, we're also dealing in the built environment. We're not dealing with something kind of ephemeral. We're not dealing with stock futures or something like that. We're actually dealing with the built environment. And we have a responsibility, while we're doing well for our investors, to make sure we don't leave a mess behind us in terms of the buildings we put up and the way they work. So it's not something that will ever drive the bus. It shouldn't. The thing that should drive the bus is doing well for our investors. But if we leave a mess behind, we've lost an opportunity. And I think with that, I'll leave you.